Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. Also, thank you to the festival for inviting me to present. I'd like to briefly go over today with you over some general concepts about money, and then get on the concrete issue on cryptocurrency policy in Latin America. So, a few concepts that we should begin with. Let's do a bit of history. Long time ago, 19th century, early 20th, trade was settled with shipments of physical gold. So can you imagine the biophysical requirement of people mobilizing ships and so on to settle trade, international trade? But that was quickly replaced by gold certificates made of paper, like checks that represented gold. In the current financial system, this is called unallocated gold, and it's basically a checking account of gold. In theory, countries can still request the physical gold, but in practice, it's very hard to get it back. We had a very key historical episode in 1931 when Latin American countries had basically all of their gold stored in the Bank of England, and the Bank of England decided that they would not give it back. So they just gave back little pieces of paper and they kept the physical gold. So this is a risk that's little talked about, but it's present in current contemporary dynamics as well. After the Second World War and the 1944 Bretton Woods Convention in the US, the dollar became the world currency, but with a commitment from the United States government that if another country would show up with a bunch of dollars, they would convert or trade those dollars for physical gold. That was the dollar gold standard. In 1971, especially after some tensions with European powers, the conversion unilaterally ended in what was denominated the Nixon shock. So that was the end of the dollar gold standard, and we began a different standard. In 1969, so very close to that same era, another instrument was created. This is the first synthetic currency in the history of the world. You could even call it the first crypto. It was the SDR. The SDR is the special drawing right. It even has its own ISO code for currencies, XDR. It was approved by an international treaty in 1969, and it was first issued in 1970. This is a very interesting instrument because this money is issued by a very little known institution, which is called the Special Drawing Rights Department at the International Monetary Fund, which is independent of the IMF, but linked to it in the governance level. And they are only distributed to countries, to central banks, to government treasuries, and so on. This currency, the world currency, the SDR, was forgotten for decades. For decades, it was not discussed about, not in the mainstream media, not in the academia. The experts forgot about it until the year 2009, when the great financial crisis finally pushed the IMF and the countries that are members of the IMF to push an extraordinary issuance of SDRs. And most recently, in the context of the pandemic, after there was a change in administration from Trump to Biden, the United States acquiesced, so voted in favor of a new, very large $650 billion worth issuance of SDRs that were distributed to every country in the world. But they were not distributed in a very equitable manner. They were distributed basically according to economic weight, to economic power, and that meant the richest countries got most of the SDRs. But the rich countries have no use for them because it's almost like an antiquity, right? The SDRs have no current use for them. But in this occasion, poorer countries, low and middle income countries, and almost all the countries in Latin America actually did use the SDRs. They traded them for dollars, and then they purchased vaccines, food, equipment for solving or helping to solve the crisis. It's very interesting because since this last issuance, the SDR has been gaining a lot of traction, still not enough around the world, And even the IMF in 2019 published a piece speculating that perhaps the SDR could become the global monetary currency, the global monetary unit in what they called the ESDR, so the electronic SDR, something that could be used in people's pockets and could be used to settle all international payments. Remember the Nixon shock when the gold standard finished. Then we had the phenomenon of the petrodollar, and this is very important if we want to link money and sustainability, money and the climate crisis, money and the biophysical world. And it's very important because when the gold standard finished, the dollar needed another lever so that it could remain the most important currency in the world. And Kissinger traveled to the Gulf monarchies, mainly Saudi Arabia, and agreed that all oil from the Gulf would be sold and denominated in dollars. Not in francs, not in marks, not in pounds, not in anything else, but in dollars. So that's important. Why? Because not only does the US benefit directly from that because it can print its own dollars, but also it means that other smaller countries that do not have oil have to first sell their exports for dollars in order to then buy energy, in order to then get possible economic activity derived from energy. So it's a very energy dollar linked world. We cannot underestimate the importance of the dollar in the dynamics of oil and carbonization and energy in general in the current in the contemporary world. There was a discussion in 2019. The European Union called for a consultation when they said, hey, maybe we should be able to buy oil also in euros. The answer was, yes, we could, but let's not get in that way because it involves very strong geopolitical tensions. Another characteristic of the world nowadays is dollarization. And this you can find, for example, in the general cryptocurrency market. Cryptocurrencies are valued in dollars. Very little do you find valuation of cryptocurrencies in anything other else than US dollars. But in our economies, everything is dollarized. We even have full countries like my own that's fully dollarized, legally dollarized, where the official currency is the US dollar. But in most of Latin America, it is de facto dollarized. People think in dollar terms and then settle with their local currencies. And then also we have a huge cash economy based in dollars, unfortunately also due to what we call the narco-dollar standard, right? So the huge amount of dollars that come from the United States in cash form and are distributed due to the value chains of the narco system. Now, something very important to understand the logic of cryptocurrency policy in Latin America, it is to understand what xenodollars are. And xenodollars are money units denominated in dollars, so you can count them in dollars, but they are created outside of the US dollar banking system, the US financial system. They don't have the guarantee of the US government, even though they are denominated in US dollars. And you can find several examples that I mentioned on the slide. This is important because when push comes to shove in crises, xenodollars eventually have to go knock on the door of the US government. And that happens in one way or another. Now, something very important to understand about the logic of dollarization, the logic of the international money system and how it affects the policy alternatives in domestic economies is that they are all subject to the international correspondent banking system. And it is basically controlled by the large world megabanks, right? So we have here a selection of 29 of the world's megabanks according to the Financial Stability Board, and they basically control international trade, international settlement of money. All the transactions that you do from one place to another eventually end up being settled in one of these banks. Very importantly, JP Morgan is the one that has the most, the broadest international correspondent banking network in the world. This is what I call the sword of Damocles. Whenever a country tries to gain a little bit of sovereignty in terms of their international currency policy, they have to face this reality. The network effects, the geopolitical issues, the coercion that's implicit in the international money dynamics force it that they have to go through the correspondent banking networks that exist nowadays. And basically that's concentrated in the United States, specifically in New York City. In the case of Latin America, it's New York City and Miami. Some people say Miami is the capital city for the money-wise in the case of Latin America, because money definitely has to flow through that financial center. The rest of the world also has a strong dependence on the US dollar. And as you can see in this slide, you have very few alternatives where the main correspondent banking partners are not in the US. In some cases for former French colonies in France, some European countries in Germany. So this is very important because this means that you are extremely dependent on the role of the US financial system if you're a Latin American country. Now, what did we do to try to gain a little bit of monetary space, to try to change the dynamics of money that would always end up flowing in forms of capital flight and the correspondent banking system to those centers of power? We decided we would democratize money in Ecuador. And democratizing money is synonymous of democratizing banks. And the most powerful bank in any society is the central bank, right? Because it is the one who governs, who regulates, but also who manages the settlement of the entire money system. And in Ecuador, we democratized our central bank and we did something absolutely radical. We opened the central bank. We did the first central bank API so that we would create an open innovation system based on the central bank's technology, which was definitely one of the most advanced technologies in the government system in Ecuador and probably the entire financial system of Ecuador. And we did a hackathon with an open API so that university students, entrepreneurs, anybody who wanted to innovate and connect to a central bank and develop monetary alternatives, such as linking with blockchain, such as creating payment solutions and other fintechs, was done. This was extremely radical for its time. I still haven't seen any other central bank that has really opened its API in terms of facilitating access for people. And we created the first central bank digital currency. It was based on a very, very sort of basic protocol, which is the USSD protocol, a messaging protocol in the most simplest of the phones. You don't even require a smartphone, so that people could have access to their money. And this was then opened for society in general. You could say this was the first experiment in Latin America, but it has had implications in the region, and I will explain shortly. Venezuela, a country governed by a socialist coalition, was the first country to also issue its own sovereign cryptocurrency called the petro. The petro is tied, it's basically a stable coin tied to the value of the dollar and the oil market. And it has also developed a large cryptocurrency ecosystem for two reasons. Because Venezuela has been undergoing inflation and hyperinflation in the last years, and also to facilitate cross-border payments because they now face sanctions from basically the US government. These sanctions have been waning in the last few days, but this led to the creation of a very large cryptocurrency market in Venezuela. Another country that was an early adopter of cryptocurrency, it wasn't a libertarian, it wasn't anarchist, it wasn't, very capitalist based, it was Cuba. And it was also because of US sanctions. So the Trump administration put sanctions against Cuba, basically not allowing banks in the United States or remittance companies to transfer money from Cuban families to their family members in Cuba. And of course, that led to an immediate crisis in terms of the balance of payments. And Cuba thus said, fine, we're going to legalize cryptocurrencies mainly for receiving remittances. So that opened an entire new market in the place perhaps where you would least expect it to. This also happened to an organization called Progressive International. I am a member of Progressive International. It's a coalition of social movements, parties, organizations that around the world that try to create global change, global policy change with progressive principles. When we were in Cuba trying to promote Cuba's vaccine technology so that it could be exported for free, so that it could be produced elsewhere in the world, because of that, we pushed for a campaign, and we were blocked by European banks because of the United States embargo. So we decided, okay, we're going to adopt the same policy that Cuba did and accept also donations in cryptocurrency. And this is for a Western-based organization that had to face the same consequences that the people of Cuba do. And then also something very interesting, and I'm close to finishing, which is the El Salvador experiment, right? So El Salvador passed a law declaring Bitcoin as legal tender. So it does not replace the domestic currency, which is actually the US dollar, but the law says that all the accounting has still to be done in the US dollar. Now, this is very important because that eventually means that it's not being accepted as a unit of account, and it doesn't acquire all the properties of a currency. It also created its own state-owned wallet provider called Chivo. And that's perhaps one of the most important elements that's not talked about, because Chivo, in reality, is basically an electronic money system available for all Salvadorian citizens, where they supposedly have Bitcoins accredited to them, but they're not blockchain Bitcoins. They are Xeno-Bitcoins. They are representations of Bitcoins. They are certificates of Bitcoins that can be tradable and converted to Bitcoins eventually, but they are actually managed in a centralized conventional database of the state-owned wallet provider. This is perhaps a little-known element of the Salvadorian experiment, but it shows how countries, independent of the valuation that we have of their governments, seek to gain flexibility in the conventional monetary system. Now, I'm going to conclude with some ideas. In Latin America, cryptocurrency policy is not only about innovation, it's also about financial inclusion. People are always thinking how we can broaden the access of money to people. And we have two alternatives of how we can see financial inclusion. A top-down financial inclusion, which is the typical financial inclusion that we get, in mainstream policy circles, where they say, well, just give everybody a Visa or a MasterCard, right? And then tie it to a bank account, with a big transnational bank. Or the bottom-up financial inclusion, which is trying to recognize the already existing social dynamics and social structures in Latin American and Global South countries that also exist in the Global North, such as cooperatives, cajas, cases, and so on, so that they can be included as part of the payment system, both nationally and internationally. We also see that this sort of different approach to innovation that we have seen in Latin America is going to conflict with a intent to standardize and make everything uniform in terms of payments with the ISO 20022 initiative. This is not being discussed in progressive policy circles, in alternative financial policy circles, and basically only in the mainstream banking circles. And then finally, something that I think is very important. We need to open the central banks. I know that for communities, for example, here, they don't like the central bank and they think it'll go away if you ignore it. It won't. The central bank is a prime institution of the monetary system and of society in general. We have to open and democratize the central banks. we have to assume the challenge and try to reform them, to make them be worried about sustainability, about the climate crisis, about inclusion. We need to decolonize money, decarbonize finance, and we need to change the money ecosystem to principles based on buen vivir. Thank you very much. That's my contact information if anybody wants to write. Thank you.
If you have any questions, we have about 5 to 10 minutes so we can talk about that. Please come to me. 5 minutes left. Anybody who has a question, please raise your hand. Come to me. I take it.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Hi, thank you so much for this great presentation. I have a question. I'm not too sure if it's the right way to ask, but there's an app called Reserve, Reserve, and it's selling basically offering people to buy in stable coins. I think it's very popular in, where was it? I'm not sure. I thought it was Venezuela, but I'm not too sure. Do you have any opinion on that app? Because I heard for I think it was a short amount of time that it was like one of the most popular apps to download.
Yeah, so I couldn't comment specifically on any app, but in principle, well, we have to check that it wouldn't be replicating in terms of, I guess, user guarantees, the same pattern of buying representations of stablecoins or representations of cryptocurrencies, but actually having demonstrable evidence that you're actually buying it on chain. And if possible, if you're concerned about the safety of your money, perhaps making sure that you can have a self-custodial wallet related to that intermediary, right? So that's what I can comment regarding that.
Maybe a very German question, but there's obviously some privacy concerns related to if you have a central ledger that can see every transaction you make. Is that a conversation in Latin America also?
Yeah, it is a conversation. It doesn't have the same dimension as here in Europe. There are technological alternatives to design a central ledger, a central bank digital currency with anonymization, with zero knowledge proof technology, for example. But I think independent of the question of privacy or not, it's really important that CBDCs are being discussed. And I think that we should accept that they go forward, of course, with the privacy concerns being addressed. Because why? Because it will open the conversation between citizens and the central bank. Right now, central bank is sort of this distant entity that it seems too hard and too far away from society. If we start having direct connection with the central bank via CBDC, that will open up the discussion, and it will entirely create opportunities for innovation, but also policy reform, and then we can start demanding more things from the central bank in terms of the regular financial policy.
Hi, what is your opinion about the El Salvador experiment or experience? Where do you think it worked out well? Where do you think it didn't work out well? And do you think other countries will adopt it, especially in Latin America?
Yeah, I think that's what it was, an experiment. I think it has some serious problems. It's important to mention that the original El Salvador proposal was not to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. It was to create a local stable coin of Zeno dollars, because they are a dollarized country and they need more dollars for their domestic economy. And because they thought that that policy approach would have some marketing problems and would not be so understood by society, they decided to jump on Bitcoin more as a marketing effect than an actual adoption of the Bitcoin currency. The amounts that they are purchasing are, I mean, they're huge for any country, but they're still tiny compared to the budget or to their international reserves and so on. So I think there is not a systemic effect on the Salvadorian economy. but it is a clear demonstration that with a wallet system, you can reach financial inclusion quickly. So I think that those are the elements that are worth rescuing from that experiment.
Thank you very much. Thank
There's
you,
one
Andrés Arauz. A warm welcome, please.
Thank you very much.